I challenge you to imagine yourself standing alone in a courtroom, facing years in prison with no attorney by your side. Could you identify inconsistencies in police testimony or request critical evidence to challenge their claims? For most of us, the answer is no. That's why Jalen Dawson's story matters. When this 19-year-old was wrongfully accused of stealing a luxury car, he didn't just defend himself. He transformed the courtroom into a stage where systemic injustice was forced into the spotlight. His victory against overwhelming odds isn't just inspiring. It's a blueprint for how knowledge can become armor against a system where historical prejudice often tips the scales of justice. The weight of expectation, a courtroom's silent judgment. The Los Angeles County Courthouse looms over the downtown skyline, its concrete and glass facade gleaming in the morning sun. But beyond its architectural presence, it stands as something far more consequential, a fulcrum where lives teeter between freedom and incarceration. For young black men like 19-year-old Jalen Dawson, these marble halls aren't just intimidating, they're statistically dangerous. Judge Harold Grayson adjusts his glasses as Jalen enters courtroom 3B. The judge barely looks up from his docket, announcing Dawson case Grand Theft Auto, with the enthusiasm of reading a grocery list. I see the defendant is representing himself. Let's not waste the court's time with theatrics. A few chuckles ripple through the gallery. Beautiful day for a trial, he adds, shooting a knowing glance at the prosecutor. Hoping we can wrap this up by 4. Got a tea time at Riviera. The casual exchange reveals volumes about the disconnect between their reality and Jalen's. For them, this is Tuesday. For Jalen, this is the day that determines whether he'll spend the next 5 to 7 years behind bars. The courtroom performs its silent ritual. The bailiff's hand drifts closer to his holster as Jalen approaches the defense table. The court reporter's fingers hover over her stenotype like she's typed this story 1,000 times before. In the jury box, 12 citizens make calculations before the first piece of evidence is presented. Against this backdrop, Jalen appears impossibly young and isolated in his nicest jeans and button-up shirt. Yet there's something in his gaze, an alertness, a quiet intelligence, that seems misaligned with his supposed situation. The weight of prejudgment settles around Jalen like a second skin, constricting with each breath. Research shows this burden, knowing others expect guilt before innocence, affects everything from posture to articulation. Under this crushing pressure, the mind struggles to function, a phenomenon psychologists call stereotype threat, that for black defendants acts as both personal shadow and historical inheritance. Assistant District Attorney Morgan strides to center court with the confidence of a man who's never lost a case like this one. His suit expensive, his folder thin, suggesting minimal evidence for what he considers straightforward. Your Honor, the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of a stolen vehicle. Officer Ruiz apprehended Mr. Dawson within 3 blocks of where the vehicle was abandoned. The state will demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. As Morgan speaks, Jalen isn't fidgeting or looking down. His eyes narrow, tracking specific points in the prosecutor's statement. When Morgan mentions Officer Ruiz, the corner of Jalen's mouth twitches. It's not fear, it's recognition. What nobody in the courtroom realizes is that Jalen has spent 4 years studying legal precedent and procedure. His mother, Kiana Dawson, has worked as a paralegal at the public defender's office since before Jalen was born. Every evening after school, instead of video games or sports, Jalen would help prepare case files, absorbing the language of law, memorizing landmark decisions, understanding the mechanics of how justice is supposed to work, and how it often doesn't. The night of his arrest, after posting bail with his mother's entire savings, Jalen didn't cry or rage. Instead, he pulled out case files similar to his own, studying patterns of police testimony, evidence handling protocols, and procedural requirements. In the 3 months leading to this moment, he's been preparing not just a defense, but a counterstrike. The unraveling truth, when evidence tells a different story. That counterstrike began with a question that pierced the courtroom's confidence. If my fingerprint proves I stole that car, does touching a jacket in a department store make me a shoplifter? The gallery fell silent as the jury exchanged glances, the first seed of doubt taking root in ground that moments ago seemed perfectly certain. Jalen stood with a calm that belied the stakes. His voice carried through the hushed courtroom as he methodically dismantled what the prosecution had presented as their strongest evidence. Fingerprints capture a moment of contact, Your Honor. Like a single frame torn from a film reel, they show one instant without revealing the story that surrounds it. Assistant District Attorney Morgan's shoulders tensed visibly. He shuffled papers on his desk as Jalen continued his assault on the prosecution's logic. The state wants you to believe that my fingerprint on that steering wheel proves I stole that vehicle, Jalen said, addressing the jury directly. But physical evidence only tells part of the story, and sometimes it's telling a completely different one than what's being presented here today. Judge Grayson's earlier disinterest had vanished, replaced by a furrowed brow and focused gaze. He studied Jalen with newfound interest as the young man turned abruptly toward Officer Ruiz in the witness stand. Officer, I'd like to request your patrol car's GPS logs for the night in question, specifically the times corresponding to when you claim to have observed me near the abandoned vehicle. The request hung in the air. Officer Ruiz glanced toward the prosecutor, whose complexion had drained to a sickly pale. Morgan rose to object. Your Honor, this is an unnecessary fishing expedition that will only waste the court's time. Judge Grayson studied the prosecutor for a long moment. On the contrary, Mr. Morgan, the defendant has the right to verify the witness's account. The request is granted. He turned to Jalen. Proceed, Mr. Dawson. A murmur rippled through the spectators. In the jury box, a middle-aged woman narrowed her eyes at the prosecution table, her previous expressionless demeanor replaced by scrutiny. Jalen paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. I'd also like to question the forensic specialist who processed the fingerprint evidence. Morgan cleared his throat. Your Honor, the specialist is not available to testify today. The judge removed his glasses. Not available, Mr. Morgan? The fingerprint evidence is central to your case. We have Officer Ruiz here to speak to the chain of custody, Morgan offered weakly. 3 jurors were now taking notes, their pens moving rapidly across previously untouched notepads. The courtroom's atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Jalen approached the evidence table. The prosecution has built their case brick by brick, but what they've deliberately ignored is context. For the first time, Jalen allowed emotion to enter his voice. I touched that car earlier that day. It was parked outside the 7-Eleven on Crenshaw. I admired it, a restored '67 Mustang. I placed my hand on the driver's side window, and yes, I even tried the door handle. But admiring a car isn't stealing it. The revelation landed like a thunderclap. A juror in the back row exhaled audibly. Judge Grayson's pen hovered above his notepad, frozen. The prosecution has access to the 7-Eleven security footage. They have the timestamp from my purchase inside the store. They have the owner's statement about where the car was parked throughout the day. Jalen's voice grew stronger with each sentence. Yet none of this was presented to you. Ask yourselves why. District Attorney Morgan rose stiffly. Your Honor, the state has presented clear evidence linking the defendant to the stolen vehicle. His fingerprint was on the steering wheel. And between touching something and stealing it, Jalen interrupted, his gaze sweeping across the 12 faces of the jury, lies the vast territory of reasonable doubt, the moment of truth, when racial profiling becomes undeniable. Reasonable doubt had shaken the prosecution's foundation, but what lived in Jalen's manila folder was about to collapse their entire case. The young man who had methodically dismantled the fingerprint evidence now stood straighter, a quiet confidence emanating from him as he withdrew a single sheet of paper. The courtroom, still processing his earlier arguments, couldn't possibly anticipate how this document would transform a routine theft case into something far more damning about the justice system itself. The courtroom fell silent. Every eye tracked Jalen's movements as he unfolded the paper with deliberate care. "Your Honor," Jalen said, his voice carrying a weight beyond his years, "I'd like to introduce into evidence the original statement made by Raymond Whitaker, the owner of the vehicle in question." He handed copies to the bailiff for distribution. A statement that was omitted from the prosecution's discovery materials. Judge Grayson's eyebrow arched slightly as he accepted his copy. "Proceed, Mr. Dawson." The paper trembled slightly in Jalen's hands, not from nervousness, but from the gravity of what it contained. He cleared his throat and read aloud, "Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid and he was white." The words landed with devastating precision. Assistant DA Morgan's face flushed crimson as he half rose from his chair, speechless. 3 jurors leaned forward simultaneously. A woman in the back row covered her mouth. Judge Grayson's pen hovered motionless, his usual impassive expression cracking to reveal something resembling shame. "This statement," Jalen continued, his voice stronger now, "was taken by Officer Ruiz at the scene, before they found me walking 3 blocks away. The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough." A collective intake of breath followed. The transformation was palpable. This was no longer about a stolen car, but about a system that had nearly sentenced an innocent young man to prison because of his skin color. "Your Honor," the prosecutor finally managed, rising to his feet, "we have no record of this statement in our files." "That's peculiar," Jalen responded, "considering Mr. Whitaker signed and dated it, and Officer Ruiz countersigned as the receiving officer." He slid another document across to the judge. "I've also subpoenaed Mr. Whitaker to appear today. He's waiting outside, ready to testify." The older black woman in the jury box closed her eyes briefly, her fingers gripping the railing, a lifetime of similar stories etched in the lines of her face. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was merely one that had been caught. "Studies show that black individuals are disproportionately targeted for these kinds of arrests," Jalen said, addressing the jury directly. "We're stopped more often, questioned more aggressively, and charged more frequently, even when the evidence doesn't support it." His words were methodical, factual, impossible to dismiss. The courtroom held its breath. Time seemed suspended between what had been and what might come next. Judge Grayson studied the statement, then looked at the prosecutor. "Counselor, do you wish to question Mr. Whitaker?" Assistant DA Morgan's shoulders sagged slightly as he shook his head. "No, Your Honor." "Then in light of this evidence, which should have been disclosed during discovery," Judge Grayson's voice had lost its earlier condescension, replaced by a gravity that filled the courtroom. "And considering the prosecution's failure to present a case beyond reasonable doubt, I have no choice but to dismiss all charges against Mr. Dawson." The gavel's crack echoed through the suddenly silent room. Jalen stood perfectly still, his face revealing nothing, though the slight tremor in his hands betrayed the emotional weight of the moment. He had done more than win his freedom. He had exposed a truth that many in that courtroom would have preferred to ignore. Conclusion. As the courthouse doors opened and Jalen stepped into the sunlight, his victory rippled far beyond this single case. What happened in that courtroom today wasn't just about one teenager avoiding a wrongful conviction. It was justice momentarily overcoming prejudice in a system that too often sees skin color before evidence. Cases like Jalen's serve as powerful catalysts for change, forcing uncomfortable conversations about racial bias. For every Jalen who possesses the knowledge to fight back, countless others remain trapped within the machinery of injustice. Organizations like the Innocence Project and Equal Justice Initiative labor daily against these currents, providing legal assistance to those without Jalen's advantages. The true test now lies in transforming this victory into momentum for systemic change. Will we continue sharing these stories until the scales finally balance for all? Justice isn't abstract, but a daily choice made by officers, prosecutors, and judges. Share this video, drop a comment if you've seen injustice firsthand, and subscribe for more stories.